Tehran thought it had broken Trump. That was the story the regime was selling its own people for weeks. And then the last 10 days happened, and that story didn't just fall apart. It collapsed in real time, on camera, with American names attached to it. So let's talk about exactly what's happening right now, why it's happening, and why the next few days on one 5-mile island might matter more than anything we've seen in this war so far. Here's the moment you need to understand first, because without it, none of the rest of this makes sense. Back in June, a fragile understanding between Washington and Tehran briefly took the temperature down. A memorandum of understanding held for a few weeks, oil prices eased, and in Tehran, that pause got repackaged as a win, proof that if the regime just held the line long enough, the American president would eventually back off. That was the story that got repeated across state media. We made him stand down, except that story required Tehran to forget how this war actually started. It began on February 28th, when a joint U.S.-Israeli operation carried out a decapitation strike inside Tehran that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with several senior officials around him. For a regime that had built nearly half a century of legitimacy around the idea of an untouchable clerical leadership, that first day alone was a blow nobody in Washington or Tehran had fully priced in. Within days, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, a hardline cleric with deep ties to the Revolutionary Guard, was named the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. From that day forward, this war has run on a loop. Iran fires at U.S. bases, shipping, and Gulf targets. American and partner forces intercept most of it and absorb the rest. And the United States answers with strike packages that get bigger, not smaller. And running underneath the entire war from day one has been one island, Kharg Island, 5 miles long, sitting off Iran's coast in the Persian Gulf. It doesn't look like much on a map, a comma of land in blue water, but that comma handles roughly 90% of everything Iran exports in crude oil. Nearly every dollar funding the regime's missile program, the IRGC, and its regional proxy network passes through the terminals on that island first. On March 13th, the United States hit it hard. U.S. Central Command announced a large-scale precision strike on Kharg Island that destroyed more than 90 separate Iranian military positions, naval mine storage, missile bunkers, and additional defensive infrastructure, and while deliberately leaving the oil terminals themselves untouched. Iranian state media reported over a dozen explosions and confirmed no damage to the oil infrastructure. Think about what that restraint actually communicated. The message wasn't, "We're going to strangle your economy tonight." The message was, "We can see every square foot of your most valuable economic asset. We just erased everything you built to defend it. And we chose, on purpose, not to touch the part that makes you money." That's not mercy. That's a demonstration, and a threat that the runway to reverse that choice belongs entirely to Washington. A raid built to erase more than 90 separate positions in a single night while surgically sparing the storage tanks sitting right next to them isn't something done with a handful of jets and whatever's on the rack. It requires precision-guided munitions, real-time targeting, standoff weapons capable of hitting a building from dozens of miles out, electronic warfare support to blind what's left of Iranian radar, and aerial refueling to keep strike packages on station without having to fly directly over the target. Reporting on the buildup ahead of the more recent strikes has specifically flagged additional fighter squadrons and refueling tankers being repositioned into the region well before any single attack, which tells you the escalation happening right now didn't start last week. It's been staged for months. Iran's leadership had a choice after that March strike, and analysts now broadly agree they made the wrong one. Instead of reading it as a warning shot with the safety still on, Tehran treated it as the ceiling, assuming the worst had already happened and the war would keep grinding along the same lines. Coastal radar, missile sites, nightly strikes, rinse and repeat, until eventually a deal gets negotiated because that's supposedly how these things end. Except President Trump had spent the months since openly floating something much bigger than another airstrike, taking the island itself. Asked directly by reporters, Trump has repeatedly said the U.S. may take over Kharg Island, drawing explicit comparisons to how Washington has handled Venezuelan oil infrastructure. That is not a threat to damage the terminal. That's a threat to seize it and run it, an entirely different category of escalation than anything that came before it in this war. Retired military officials who've walked through what an actual seizure would require describe a sequence that starts with total naval and air dominance established first, warships and fighter aircraft controlling the surrounding sea lanes and airspace completely, before Marines ever go ashore by helicopter, with commanders reportedly prepared to issue Iranian forces on the island a final ultimatum: surrender or be overrun. Analysts say that part might genuinely be the easy half. Kharg sits well within range of Iranian coastal artillery and whatever missile and drone capability the IRGC has managed to keep hidden after months of repeated strikes on the island's defenses. Taking the island could take hours. Holding it under sustained fire from 15 to 20 miles away is what could turn a symbolic victory into an open-ended military commitment lasting months. That's the backdrop. And then July happened. After the June ceasefire understanding collapsed, strikes resumed, and resumed hard. On July 7th, explosions were reported again on Kharg Island, this time alongside renewed strikes on Keshem Island, Iran's largest island near the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's own press TV reported multiple blasts that night. CNN geolocated video showed fires further along the coast at Bandar Abbas the same week, part of a wave U.S. Central Command described as strikes against more than 80 separate targets inside Iran, landing in the same breath as the reimposition of oil sanctions. The economic squeeze and the military squeeze running together, aimed at the same 5-mile stretch of coral keeping the regime's finances afloat. It hasn't slowed down since. Over the past 2 weeks, CENTCOM has been running consecutive nights of strikes against Iran, night after night without pause, a pace it has confirmed itself in a running string of public statements. By this week, the count had reached 11 straight nights. Then, on July 17th, Iranian ballistic missiles and drones struck Muwafaq Salty Air Base in Jordan, a coalition base hosting American troops and aircraft. 2 U.S. soldiers were killed in the initial strike. Army Private Isabella Gonzalez, 19, of Carrollton, Texas, and First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan, 25, of Ewa Beach, Hawaii. A third soldier, Sergeant Angel S. Rampersad, 28, of Ozone Park, New York, was initially listed as missing before his remains were recovered and confirmed. Nearly 100 additional service members were wounded in that attack, and a wave of related Iranian strikes on U.S. positions across the region that same week. The vast majority have since returned to duty. Separately, on July 18th, another American service member was killed in northern Iraq during a controlled detonation of an unexploded Iranian drone. These were the first American combat deaths of this war since the ceasefire collapse, and they reset the entire emotional and political temperature overnight. The current total of U.S. service members killed in this conflict now stands at 18. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the attack only stiffens American resolve. And within hours, not days, hours, CENTCOM answered with its 8th consecutive night of strikes at the time, hitting coastal surveillance, air defenses, and missile and drone storage, explicitly naming Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces as the direct target of retaliation for the Jordan attack. That's not subtle language. That's the United States telling the IRGC by name. We know who did this, and we're coming for you specifically, not just your equipment. So now, walk with me to where things actually stand as of this week, because this is where it gets genuinely tense. The naval blockade the U.S. had previously lifted under the June understanding went back into full effect in mid-July. CENTCOM has confirmed disabling non-compliant tankers attempting to reach Kharg Island, including firing on a Curacao-flagged vessel that ignored repeated warnings. During the first day of the renewed blockade alone, CENTCOM said it redirected 2 compliant ships and disabled 1 that wasn't. Iran's foreign ministry has publicly warned of unspecified repercussions if the U.S. moves on Kharg Island directly, a warning delivered this week in response to a direct question about Trump's repeated threats to seize it. And overlapping with all of that is the second flashpoint that has now become inseparable from the Kharg Island story, Pickaxe Mountain. This week, President Trump told reporters at the White House that the U.S. would soon be striking the area around Pickaxe Mountain, a heavily fortified underground facility near Iran's Natanz enrichment site that intelligence assessments suggest may now be housing centrifuges moved there for protection after last year's strikes on Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Trump has been unusually candid that there's no hard confirmed evidence of active nuclear work at the site, but has said the U.S. will hit any site where they're even thinking about nuclear very, very powerfully. Satellite imagery reviewed by nuclear analysts shows the tunnel complex has been reinforced with additional rock, soil, and concrete over the underground portals in recent weeks. Exactly the kind of hardening you'd expect if Tehran anticipated this threat becoming real. Iran's Qatam al-Anbiya military command has already warned that any strike on the site would represent, in their words, an explosion of the wider regional war. That's the second half of this equation, and it cannot be separated from the first. Kharg Island is the economic chokehold. Pickaxe Mountain is the nuclear chokehold, and both are being discussed by American officials in the same breath, as connected pieces of the same next phase, not separate contingencies. Underneath all of this sits a legal clock most people haven't been watching. A tariff authority tied to this conflict, a 10% global import surcharge invoked under Section 122 of the Trade Act, runs out by operation of law, roughly 150 days after it took effect. That's not a political deadline someone can quietly extend with a memo. It's a statutory clock, converging on the same handful of days as everything else, a war that just claimed its first American combat deaths in months, a standing threat against Iran's most valuable economic asset, and a standing threat against a facility tied to its nuclear program. Meanwhile, the human cost keeps climbing on both sides, and it's worth not losing sight of that in the middle of all the hardware talk. Dignified transfers for the fallen have already taken place at Dover Air Force Base. Congress has held hearings on the cost and trajectory of this campaign, and a war powers resolution remains a live possibility on the floor. This war has faces now, a 19-year-old private, a 25-year-old lieutenant, and that changes the political weather in Washington in ways raw strike numbers alone never could. Across the broader regional conflict, pulling in Lebanon, Israel, Iraq, and Gulf shipping lanes, casualty estimates from independent trackers now range from the thousands to well beyond that, depending on the source. This is not a controlled surgical exchange. It's a regional war with a rising weekly toll. And Kharg Island sits at the exact center of why nobody has found an off-ramp both sides are actually willing to take. Zoom out further and the picture gets bigger still. This same window has seen Houthi forces in Yemen reassert their own blockade posture against Saudi shipping near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a second global choke point hundreds of miles from Hormuz that analysts say could be triggered into more direct action depending on what happens to Iran's electrical grid. Air France has already suspended flights to Riyadh and Dubai over the deteriorating security picture and extended its Beirut suspension into August. Separately, under the terms of the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire, the U.S. this week announced pilot zones in southern Lebanon meant to begin transferring security control to the Lebanese military, a sign that even the adjacent fronts of this regional pressure system are still actively being managed, not resolved. This was never a two-country war. It's a regional pressure system, with Kharg Island at the center of its economic half and Pickaxe Mountain at the center of its military half. So why does everything keep circling back to one 5-mile stretch of coastline? Because it's quite literally the only lever that matters more than missiles. You can rebuild a destroyed radar site. You cannot easily replace 90% of a nation's export revenue disappearing overnight. Iran's mainland coastline is too shallow for the supertankers that move crude at scale, which is exactly why Kharg was built as a deep water terminal in the first place, with construction dating back to the late 1950s and full service beginning around 1960. For over 60 years, Kharg has been the funnel nearly every barrel of Iranian crude has had to pass through to reach the global market. There's no meaningful backup capable of matching its throughput, which by some accounts allows up to 10 supertankers to load simultaneously. When American officials talk about seizing the island rather than just striking it, they're talking about taking direct physical control of the one choke point that sanctions, blockades, and diplomacy have never fully been able to replace. And that's what makes the "we broke Trump" narrative Tehran was running was so spectacularly wrong. The June pause was never a permanent retreat. It was a pause folded into ongoing back-channel talks. The moment those talks collapsed, the pressure didn't just resume, it escalated past where it had been before the pause. The blockade tightened. Oil prices, which had dropped when tensions briefly eased, came roaring back, with Brent crude settling in the high 80s range by the most recent reporting, a rally that's already reversed a meaningful share of the earlier price decline. So where does this actually go from here? Nobody, and I mean nobody, including the people making these decisions in real time, has a fully settled answer yet. But here's what the reporting on the ground says to watch over the coming days: whether the next round of strikes finally extends onto Iran's electrical transmission grid, which multiple reports have flagged as the specific trigger that could widen the Bab el-Mandeb front; whether Congress moves forward on a war powers vote; whether the Section 122 tariff deadline gets used as leverage in either direction; and most of all, whether Washington decides to move on Kharg Island and Pickaxe Mountain as the connected next phase that officials keep describing them as, or whether both remain, for now, the most credible threats in modern Gulf history that never quite get executed. Every thread in this story, the oil, the casualties, the statutory deadline, the buildup already reported ahead of time, keeps pointing back at the same 5 miles of coastline. That's not a coincidence, and doesn't look like a slow-burn story much longer either. This is a fast-moving situation, the kind where facts on the ground can shift within a single news cycle. Treat everything here as where things stood at the time this was put together, not as the final word. Subscribe if this kind of breakdown is useful, because this story is not close to finished, and the next update out of Kharg Island might be the biggest one yet.